The dust rose in amber clouds across the flat Texas plain, catching the late afternoon sun like fragments of shattered glass suspended in the heavy air. It was the kind of heat that made men question their sanity, the kind that turned the horizon into a shimmering mirage where earth and sky blurred into one indistinguishable band of pale fire. In the summer of 1943, this unforgiving landscape became home to something no one could have predicted, a convergence of worlds so disparate they might as well have existed on different planets. German prisoners of war, plucked from the battlefields of North Africa and Europe, found themselves deposited into the heart of Texas ranch country, where cowboys still rode the range and the nearest town was nothing more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the wind. The war felt simultaneously distant and immediate, a paradox that would define everything that happened in those extraordinary months. The first transport arrived on a Tuesday, though the day of the week mattered little in a place where time was measured by seasons and cattle drives rather than calendars. 27 men emerged from the back of military trucks, blinking against the brutal sunlight, their faces gaunt and disoriented, still carrying the dust of battle in the creases of their skin. They wore the remnants of Wehrmacht uniforms, threadbare and faded, marked with the letters POW painted across their backs in white that had already begun to crack and peel. Some were barely more than boys, their faces smooth despite the exhaustion etched around their eyes. Others bore the weight of middle age, men who should have been tending shops or teaching mathematics, but who instead had been swept up in the machinery of war and deposited here, at the edge of the known world, in a land that seemed to belong to some mythical past they had only read about in dime novels. The ranch foreman who met them was a man named Dutch Callahan, though whether Dutch was his real name or simply what everyone called him had been lost to time and no one thought to ask anymore. He stood beside his horse, a patient roan mare named Pepper, and watched the prisoners with an expression that revealed nothing. Dutch was in his 50s, weathered by decades under the Texas sun until his skin resembled old leather, creased and permanent. His hands, resting lightly on Pepper's neck, were those of a man who had spent his entire life working, scarred and calloused, capable of both remarkable gentleness and devastating strength. He wore boots that had been resoled 3 times, jeans that had faded from indigo to something approaching sky blue, and a hat that had seen better decades. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the slow cadence of someone who had learned that words were best used sparingly. "Reckon you boys are a long way from home," he said, and though his German was non-existent and their English barely functional, something in his tone transcended language. It wasn't sympathy exactly, nor was it hostility. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of one group of human beings to another that they shared this moment, this place, this impossible situation. One of the prisoners, a tall man with hollow cheeks and intelligent eyes, stepped forward slightly. His name was Heinrich Müller, a former schoolteacher from Stuttgart who had been conscripted 3 years earlier and had spent the last 18 months wondering if he would ever see his wife and daughter again. He nodded, a small gesture that carried the weight of exhaustion and uncertainty and a tentative hope that perhaps, in this strange land, there might be something other than cruelty waiting for them. The camp itself was not what any of them expected. There were no guard towers with machine guns, no barbed wire arranged in menacing coils, no snarling dogs straining at their leashes. Instead, there was a collection of barracks hastily constructed from rough-hewn timber, already silvering under the relentless sun. There was a mess hall that smelled of coffee and something frying, a sense so normal and domestic it seemed absurd in the context of their captivity. There was an open yard where the earth had been packed hard by countless boots, and beyond that, stretching in every direction, was the vastness of the Texas landscape, miles upon miles of scrubland and prairie grass rippling in waves beneath the wind. The only barrier was distance itself, the sheer impossibility of walking across that expanse to anywhere that might offer sanctuary. It was a prison without walls, which made it the most perfect prison imaginable. The work began the next morning, before dawn broke across the eastern sky. The prisoners were roused by a bell whose tone carried clear and sharp in the cool pre-dawn air, that brief hour before the heat descended like a physical presence. They assembled in the yard, uncertain and wary, expecting perhaps the brutal labor they had heard about in whispered rumors, breaking rocks or digging ditches under the watchful eyes of guards ready to use clubs and fists to enforce compliance. Instead, they found Dutch and 3 other cowboys, men whose names they would come to know as Tex, Jimmy, and an older man everyone called simply boss, though he seemed to have no more authority than the others. These men sat astride their horses, patient and still, and in the growing light, the prisoners could see that each cowboy carried a coiled rope at his saddle, tools worn smooth by use, and that their expressions held neither cruelty nor particular kindness, just the kind of weathered neutrality born from years of dealing with livestock, weather, and the general unpredictability of life. "We got about 1,500 head that need moving to the north pasture," Dutch said, and when the translator, a nervous private from Fort Worth, stumbled over the words, Dutch repeated himself more slowly, as if volume and pace could somehow bridge the linguistic divide. "Anybody here know cattle?" The question hung in the air, absurd in its ordinariness. These were soldiers, men trained to kill and survive, not ranch hands. But slowly, hesitantly, a few hands rose. There was Klaus, who had grown up on his grandfather's farm in Bavaria and knew the particular stubbornness of livestock. There was Friedrich, who had worked summers as a boy driving sheep through mountain passes. There was Joseph, who had never touched a cow in his life but raised his hand anyway, desperate for anything that resembled purpose, normalcy, or reason to exist beyond counting the days until a future he couldn't imagine. They were given horses, actual horses, an act of trust so staggering that several of the prisoners stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. These were men who, weeks earlier, had been enemies, who had fought against American forces, who had been taught to see these people as adversaries in an existential struggle. Yet here they were, being handed the reins to animals that represented freedom, mobility, the possibility of escape. Heinrich found himself standing beside a bay gelding whose dark eyes regarded him with gentle curiosity. The horse's coat was warm beneath his palm, real and solid, the first genuinely soft thing he had touched in months. He had never ridden a horse before, had spent his adult life in classrooms conjugating verbs and discussing literature, but when Dutch appeared beside him, demonstrating with patience how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to communicate with this creature through subtle shifts of weight and gentle pressure, Heinrich felt something long dormant stir within him. It was possibility, that dangerous emotion he had learned to suppress in the camps, in the chaos of battle, in the long nights wondering if morning would come. The cattle drive became a strange dance of cultures and expectations, a collision that somehow resolved into something workable, even beautiful in its own chaotic way. The cattle themselves cared nothing for the nationality or the history of the men moving them, responding only to pressure and direction, to the ancient instincts that governed their behavior. The prisoners learned quickly, or they were left behind, and being left behind meant returning to the emptiness of the barracks, to sitting with their thoughts and memories, which was a torment no one wanted. So they learned to ride, bouncing uncomfortably in saddles that chafed through their thin pants, their hands blistering on the reins, their legs screaming from muscles and used to gripping the sides of an animal that had its own ideas about direction and pace. They learned to read the cattle, to anticipate when a cow would bolt, to work together in cutting out stragglers and keeping the herd moving as a single organism. And in learning these things, they began to talk to the cowboys, not in complete sentences but in fragments, in gestures and demonstrations and the occasional word that transcended language. Dutch proved to be a teacher of infinite patience, a quality born perhaps from years of training young horses and breaking colts, work that required the ability to remain calm in the face of chaos and to see potential in creatures that seemed impossibly wild. When Klaus's horse spooked at a rattlesnake coiled beneath a mesquite bush, nearly throwing him into a patch of prickly pear, Dutch rode over calmly, caught the trailing reins, and spoke to both horse and man in the same low, soothing tone. "Easy now, easy. Nothing here gonna hurt you if you stay calm." Whether he was addressing the horse or Klaus was unclear, and perhaps it didn't matter. Klaus, his heart hammering in his chest, found his breathing slowly returning to normal, found the panic receding. Dutch handed him back the reins, nodded once, and rode away, leaving Klaus with the distinct impression that he had just been given something valuable, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what. The days developed a rhythm, rising before dawn, riding out into the vast emptiness, working until the heat became unbearable, then breaking for a meal eaten in whatever shade could be found, often just the shadow of a horse standing patiently, tail swishing at flies. The food was strange to them, heavy on beans and cornbread and strong coffee that tasted like it had been brewed from ground leather but which they learned to crave. There were no tables, no proper plates, just tin dishes that burned their hands and canteens filled with water that was never quite cold enough. They ate sitting on the ground or leaning against fence posts, and gradually, the rigid separation between prisoner and cowboy began to erode, worn away by shared exhaustion and the leveling effect of physical labor in extreme conditions. It was Jimmy who first offered Heinrich a cigarette, a casual gesture made without thinking, the kind of thing one working man might offer another during a break. Heinrich took it, surprised, his fingers trembling slightly as Jimmy struck a match and cupped his hands around the flame against the wind. They smoked in silence for a moment, two men who theoretically should have been enemies, standing together in the afternoon heat, watching the cattle settle into grazing patterns across the pasture. Jimmy was young, perhaps 22, with red hair that was already thinning at the temples and a sprinkling of freckles across his sunburned nose. He had tried to enlist 3 times before they finally took him, his eyesight being just poor enough that they had rejected him twice, and he carried a slight resentment about it, feeling he had missed the great adventure of his generation. Now, standing beside this German prisoner, he found himself wondering what adventure actually meant, whether glory was something found in battles or in moments like this, small and unremarkable, 2 human beings sharing tobacco in silence. "Where you from?" Jimmy asked finally, the question coming out awkward, as if he had been working up to it and now felt foolish for asking. Heinrich considered the question, wondering how to compress his entire existence into something comprehensible. "Stuttgart," he said finally. "Is city. Big city." He gestured with his hands, trying to indicate size, buildings, the bustle of urban life, but his gestures felt inadequate. "I am teacher." Was teacher. Literature, history. The words came haltingly, pulled from the fragments of English he had studied years ago and had thought forgotten until necessity dragged them back to the surface. Jimmy nodded, as if this made perfect sense, as if meeting a German literature teacher in the middle of a Texas cattle ranch was the most natural thing in the world. "Must be real different from this," he said, gesturing at the landscape around them, the emptiness and space that seemed to swallow everything. Heinrich laughed, a sound that surprised him with its genuineness. "Yes. Very different. Everything here is." He searched for the word, big. "So much space. In Germany, everything is close. Houses, people, everything together." He took another drag from the cigarette, watching the smoke dissipate instantly in the wind. "Is beautiful though. This place. Terrible also, but beautiful." That conversation, brief and halting as it was, marked a turning point, though no one would have recognized it at the time. Word spread among the prisoners that the cowboys were not like the guards they had known, not like the soldiers who had captured them or the officers who had processed them through the machinery of detention. These men were something else entirely, operating according to rules that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with the unwritten codes of the range, codes that valued competence, reliability, and the ability to do a hard day's work without complaint. The prisoners began to understand that their status here was conditional on their usefulness, yes, but also on something more fundamental, on being able to pull their weight, to contribute, to become part of the machinery of the ranch rather than merely inhabitants of a camp that happened to be located on ranch property. The first serious test came 3 weeks into their time there, when a summer storm rolled across the plains with the fury that only Texas storms can achieve, transforming the sky from clear blue to roiling black in a matter of minutes. The cattle, already nervous from the dropping pressure and the smell of rain on the wind, began to move, not running exactly but walking with purpose toward the east, following some instinct that told them to move, to get away from whatever was coming. Dutch, reading the signs in the cattle's behavior and the particular quality of the light, made a decision that would have been unthinkable to the military command that technically oversaw the camp. He rode back to where the prisoners were working a section of fence line, pulled up beside Heinrich, and spoke quickly. "We got a situation. Storm's coming, and the herd's gonna run. We need every man out there helping to keep them from scattering to hell and gone. You boys up for it?" The translator, pale and nervous, rendered this into German, and Heinrich felt something tighten in his chest. This was it, the moment of choice, the decision that would define who they were in this place. He looked at the other prisoners, saw his own uncertainty reflected in their faces, but also something else, a hunger for purpose, for meaning, for the chance to be more than captives waiting out the war. He turned back to Dutch and nodded. "We help," he said simply. What followed was chaos of a kind none of them had experienced in battle, a pure and primal chaos that had nothing to do with human conflict and everything to do with the raw power of nature asserting itself. The storm hit with a wall of wind that seemed solid enough to lean against, bringing with it rain that fell not in drops but in sheets, turning the world into a gray blur where visibility extended no more than a few feet. The cattle panicked, breaking into a run that shook the earth, 1,500 animals moving as one terrified organism, and the men, cowboys and prisoners alike, spurred their horses forward into that maelstrom, trying to get ahead of the herd, to turn them, to prevent them from running themselves to death or scattering across 50 miles of prairie. Heinrich found himself riding beside Tex, a man who rarely spoke but who rode with the kind of effortless grace that suggested he had been born on horseback. They were trying to turn the lead steers, getting ahead of the surge of bodies and noise and panic, their horses moving with a sure-footedness that seemed miraculous given the mud and darkness and driving rain. Lightning cracked across the sky, close enough that Heinrich could feel the hair on his arms stand up, close enough that the thunder was instantaneous and deafening, and in that flash of white light, he saw the whole scene rendered in stark relief, saw the cattle with their eyes rolling white, saw Tex leaning forward in his saddle, saw the prairie transformed into a churning sea of mud and grass and rain, and he felt absolutely, impossibly alive. He didn't remember making the decision to rope the lead steer, didn't remember his hands reaching for the rope at his saddle or forming the loop or throwing it with anything approaching accuracy, but somehow his loop settled around the steer's horns, and he felt the rope go taut, felt his horse brace and turn, using its weight and strength to check the steer's momentum. It worked, impossibly, miraculously, and the steer turned, and the cattle behind it, following that ancient instinct to follow the leader, began to turn as well, their run becoming a circle, their panic gradually transforming into something more manageable. Other ropes were flying now, other cowboys and prisoners working in concert to contain and control and eventually calm the herd, and by the time the storm passed, leaving behind a scrubbed clean sky and steam rising from the earth, they had done it, had prevented disaster through skill and courage in something that resembled teamwork in its purest form. They gathered afterward, soaked to the skin and exhausted, mud-covered and trembling from the adrenaline slowly draining from their systems. Dutch rode among them, checking for injuries, counting heads to ensure no one had been lost, and when he came to Heinrich, he stopped, looked at him for a long moment, then did something that transcended all barriers of language and nationality and history. He extended his hand. Heinrich stared at it, this calloused, weathered hand offered in a gesture of respect between equals, and felt something break inside him, some wall he had built to survive captivity and war and uncertainty. He reached out and grasped Dutch's hand, felt the firmness of the grip, saw the slight nod of acknowledgement, and understood that something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer merely a prisoner. He was, in some way he couldn't quite define, a hand, a working cowboy, a man who had proven himself under conditions that stripped away everything except essential character. The dynamics of the camp changed after the storm. The prisoners still slept in their barracks, still wore their marked uniforms, still lived within the technical constraints of their captivity, but the psychological landscape had transformed. The cowboys began to teach them things beyond the basics of cattle work, skills that required trust and patience. Boss, the older man whose real name turned out to be Robert but whom no one ever called anything but Boss, spent hours showing Klaus how to mend tack, how to read leather for weak spots, how to replace a broken stirrup or repair a bridle, his gnarled hands moving with practiced precision while he spoke in a low rumble, explaining not just the how but the why, the philosophy of maintaining equipment that your life might depend on. Friedrich learned to break young horses, working with Jimmy to gentle animals that had never known saddle or rider, discovering that violence and force were ultimately less effective than patience and consistency, that earning an animal's trust required becoming predictable, safe, reliable. The translation barrier remained, but it ceased to be the insurmountable obstacle it had first appeared. They developed a hybrid language of gestures and demonstrations, of English words mixed with German, of drawings in the dirt and objects held up for examination. More importantly, they developed the wordless communication that comes from working together toward common goals, the ability to anticipate what was needed, to coordinate actions through observation and intuition rather than explicit instruction. When Klaus saw Dutch reaching for something, he knew to hand it to him before being asked. When Heinrich noticed a cow separating from the herd, he moved to turn it back without needing direction. They became, in the way that working crews always do when the work is hard and the stakes are real, a unit, a team, a group of individuals functioning as something greater than the sum of their parts. The letters from home, when they came, arrived with the irregularity of all wartime mail, routed through multiple military channels and censored by authorities whose job was to ensure nothing sensitive passed between prisoners and their families. Heinrich received his first letter nearly 2 months into his time at the ranch, the envelope so creased and worn it was almost falling apart, the paper inside thin enough to see through. His wife had written it 6 months earlier, before she knew where he was or whether he was even alive, writing to an address that might no longer exist, casting her words out into the void in the desperate hope they might somehow reach him. Her handwriting was familiar, achingly so, the careful script she had learned as a schoolgirl and had never entirely abandoned despite the chaos engulfing their world. She wrote about their daughter, who was 7 now and asking questions her mother couldn't answer, about the apartment that had been damaged but not destroyed in a bombing raid, about the small mercies that made survival possible, a neighbor who shared bread, a lucky find of potatoes in a market stall, the fact that she had work and therefore ration cards and therefore a chance to endure until the war ended and he came home. He read the letter sitting under a cottonwood tree at the edge of the ranch yard, the paper trembling in his hands, and when he looked up, he found Dutch standing nearby, not watching exactly but present, offering the silent companionship that was his way of providing comfort. Heinrich tried to explain, fumbling for English words that might convey the complexity of what he felt, relief that they were alive mixed with guilt that he was here, safe and fed and working in the sun while they endured privation and danger, gratitude for these few pages of connection mixed with anguish at how long they had taken to arrive and how much could have changed in the interim. "Your family?" Dutch asked, the question simple but encompassing everything that mattered. Heinrich nodded, not trusting his voice. Dutch was quiet for a moment, then sat down, his back against the tree trunk, and began to speak in his slow, measured way. He talked about his own family, about a wife who had died of influenza back in '32, about a son who was somewhere in the Pacific fighting a war that Dutch didn't entirely understand but accepted as necessary because that's what young men of his son's generation were doing. He talked about the letters he received every few weeks, censored to the point of near meaninglessness but precious anyway because they confirmed existence, continued presence in the world. He talked about worry, about helplessness, about loving people you couldn't protect, and in talking about these universal human experiences, he gave Heinrich permission to feel what he was feeling without shame or the need to suppress it for the sake of maintaining stoic prisoner dignity. "We do what we can with what we got," Dutch said finally. "Ain't much else to be done. You're here, they're there, and the best thing you can do for them is stay alive and stay sane until this whole mess is over and you can go home." It was pragmatic advice, perhaps even obvious, but hearing it spoken aloud by this weathered cowboy under a Texas sky made it feel like wisdom, like a principle worth building a life around. As summer deepened into fall, the work patterns shifted with the seasons. There was fencing to repair, miles of barbed wire strung across posts that needed replacing after years of exposure to sun and wind. There were buildings to maintain, roofs to patch, doors to hang, all the mundane labor that kept a working ranch functioning. The prisoners became proficient at tasks that had nothing to do with their pre-war lives, developing calluses and muscles in new places, learning to judge the quality of lumber by feel and the straightness of a post by eye. They learned to appreciate small comforts, the pleasure of cold water from a well on a hot afternoon, the satisfaction of seeing fence lines stretch straight and true across the landscape, the camaraderie of sharing a meal after a hard day's work. The Cowboys began to share more of their culture, small gifts of understanding that bridged the enormous gulf of language and history. Tex taught several of them to play poker, a slow process given the language barrier, but card games have their own logic that transcends words, and soon there were regular games in the evening, prisoners and cowboys sitting together on the barrack steps, betting with matchsticks and pebbles, laughing at terrible hands and celebrating unlikely victories. Boss brought out a harmonica one evening, playing tunes that were both melancholy and uplifting, songs about vast landscapes and lonely nights and the enduring human capacity to find beauty in hardship. Joseph, who had studied violin before the war, fashioned a crude fiddle from a cigar box and wire, and though it produced sounds that could generously be called music only in the most abstract sense, the act of creation and the attempt at harmony moved everyone who heard it. Jimmy proved to be a storyteller, spinning tales of the Old West that were probably more fiction than fact but which captured something essential about the mythology of the place, stories of cattle drives that stretched for months, of showdowns and outlaws and men who lived by codes that made sense only in the context of complete isolation and self-reliance. The prisoners, in turn, began to share their own stories, describing cities and forests and mountains that the cowboys could scarcely imagine, places where people lived stacked on top of each other in buildings that scraped the sky, where trains could take you across an entire country in a day, where history was measured in centuries rather than generations. They were creating, without quite realizing it, a shared narrative, a story about men from impossibly different worlds finding common ground in the space between their differences. The first winter brought cold that surprised everyone, the prisoners because they had somehow imagined Texas as perpetually hot, and the cowboys because this particular winter was brutal even by their standards. The wind howled across the plains with nothing to stop it, carrying sleet and occasional snow, transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. The work continued because animals still needed tending, fences still needed maintaining, and survival still required daily labor, but it became an endurance test, a matter of pushing through cold that made fingers go numb and wind that stole the breath from your lungs. The cowboys shared gloves and jackets, extra layers that technically violated regulations about prisoner property but which no one in authority cared enough to enforce, because letting men freeze for the sake of rules seemed both cruel and pointless. It was during this winter that Ernst nearly died, a reminder that even in this relatively benign captivity, the world remained dangerous and indifferent to human survival. Ernst was younger than most, barely 19, and had been captured in North Africa after his unit was overrun. He had a tendency toward recklessness, a young man's conviction of his own invulnerability, and when a cow became trapped in a partially frozen creek, Ernst went after it without waiting for help or properly assessing the situation. The ice gave way beneath him, plunging him into water so cold it was shocking, literally stopping the heart, and by the time they pulled him out, his lips were blue and he wasn't breathing. Dutch and Boss worked on him with the calm efficiency of men who had dealt with emergencies before, stripping off his wet clothes, wrapping him in blankets, forcing warmth back into his body through friction and proximity and sheer determination. They carried him to the main house, the big ranch house that had been standing since the 1880s, and laid him before the fireplace, taking turns maintaining the fire and monitoring his breathing, speaking to him even though he was unconscious, calling him back from wherever he had gone. Heinrich and Klaus took shifts sitting with him through the night, and it was during one of these long vigils, watching Ernst's chest rise and fall with increasing regularity, that Heinrich understood something profound about the nature of humanity and care. These cowboys had no obligation to save Ernst, no reason to risk their own health staying up through the freezing night to monitor a German prisoner who, in the grand scheme of the war, meant nothing. Yet they had done it anyway, not because of orders or duty or even conscious morality, but because it was simply what one did when another human being needed help. It was a kind of ethics so fundamental it preceded thought, operating at a level deeper than nationality or politics or the artificial divisions that the war had created. Ernst survived, though he lost 2 toes to frostbite and carried a cough for months afterward, and his survival became another story in the growing mythology of the camp, another example of the strange bonds being forged in this unlikely place. He was subdued after his brush with death, less inclined to recklessness, more thoughtful in his actions, and in his gratitude, he began to teach some of the cowboys German, simple phrases at first but gradually becoming more complex, until Tex could stumble through basic conversations and Jimmy could curse competently in 2 languages, which he found endlessly amusing. Spring arrived with the suddenness that characterized all seasonal changes in this landscape, the world transforming from brown to green seemingly overnight, wildflowers erupting across the prairie in riots of color that seemed impossible after months of dormancy. The prisoners had now been at the ranch for nearly a year, and in that time, they had become as much a part of the place as the cottonwood trees or the windmills that dotted the horizon. They moved with the confidence of men who knew their work, who understood cattle and horses and the rhythms of ranch life. Their English had improved to the point where conversations were possible, and the artificial boundaries that had initially separated prisoner from cowboy had eroded to such a degree that visitors to the ranch, had there been any, might have struggled to tell the difference. It was Dutch who first broached the subject of what would happen when the war ended, a topic everyone had been carefully avoiding because contemplating the future required acknowledging the provisional nature of their current existence. They were sitting on the porch of the bunkhouse, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid to be real, and Dutch spoke into the comfortable silence that had settled over the group. "Been thinking," he said, which was how he often began statements of importance, as if the thinking itself was worth noting. "When this war winds down and you boys get to go home, there's gonna be a lot of work rebuilding. Gonna need folks who know how to work hard, how to manage stock, how to fix what's broken." He paused, considering his words carefully. "Any of you wanted to come back here, I reckon we could find a place for you. Wouldn't be charity. Would be honest work for honest pay, same as anyone else." The offer hung in the air, stunning in its implications. Heinrich felt something tighten in his throat, a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't quite parse. The idea that he might want to return to this place, this land of extreme heat and brutal cold and distances that swallowed everything, seemed absurd. Yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt, the sense that something had happened to him here, some fundamental shift in perspective that meant he would never again be quite the same person who had stumbled off that transport truck nearly a year ago. He thought of his wife and daughter, of Stuttgart, of the life he had built before the war destroyed it, and knew that returning to them was his deepest desire, his most fundamental need. But he also knew that the man who would return to them had been changed by this experience, had learned things about himself and humanity in survival that he could never unlearn, and that this Texas ranch would forever occupy a strange and complicated place in his heart. Klaus was the first to respond, his voice careful and measured. "Is generous offer, Dutch. Very generous. But is also complicated, yes? We are enemies. Your country, my country, we fight war. This." He gestured around them, encompassing the ranch and everything it represented. "This is like dream, like we step outside of war for small time. But war is real. History is real. We cannot forget this." Dutch nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of Klaus's words. "Ain't saying it would be simple. Ain't saying folks wouldn't have feelings about it. But seems to me that if we can work together here, can trust each other with our lives the way we have, then maybe there's something there worth building on. War's gonna end someday, one way or another, and when it does, we're all gonna have to figure out how to live with each other again. Might as well start with the folks we already know we can work alongside." It was a philosophy born of pragmatism rather than idealism, typical of Dutch's approach to most things, but it contained a kernel of hope that felt precious in a world that had offered so little of that commodity. They talked late into the night, discussing possibilities and obstacles, sharing dreams and fears, mapping out futures that might never materialize but which were worth contemplating anyway. They talked about the work that would need doing in a post-war world, the rebuilding of cities and infrastructure and societies that had been torn apart. They talked about families and how to bridge the years of separation and trauma. They talked about memory and whether they would be able to tell their children and grandchildren about this strange interlude, this moment when enemies became colleagues, when captivity became partnership, when the rigid categories of war dissolved into something more nuanced and human. The war did end, of course, first in Europe and then in the Pacific, and with its ending came the dissolution of the camp and the complicated process of repatriation. The prisoners were processed through military channels, documented and debriefed and prepared for the long journey home. There were formal farewells, official handshakes and paperwork, but the real goodbyes happened on the ranch, away from the bureaucracy and regulations, in the places where they had worked and lived and become something more than prisoner and guard. Heinrich found Dutch alone in the stable, checking the hooves of a mare who had been favoring her left front leg. They worked together in silence for a while, the way they had countless times before, Heinrich holding the mare's head and speaking softly to her while Dutch examined and cleaned the hoof, eventually finding and removing a small stone that had been causing the problem. When they finished, Dutch straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, and looked at Heinrich with an expression that held both sadness and something like pride. "You turned out to be a pretty decent hand," Dutch said, which coming from him was praise of the highest order. Heinrich smiled, feeling the inadequacy of words in the face of what he wanted to express. "You teach me much, Dutch. Not just about cattle and horses. About..." He struggled for the right words, "about being man. About honor that is not about winning or medals, but about work and trust and keeping your word." Dutch nodded, accepting this, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a set of spurs, beautiful old pieces worked in silver with intricate designs, clearly valuable and clearly worn. "These were my father's," he said. "He gave them to me when I became a real cowboy, not just a boy playing at it. Figure you've earned the right to call yourself a cowboy too, even if you're gonna be doing it back in Germany." He pressed them into Heinrich's hands, closing Heinrich's fingers around them. "You take care of yourself. You get home to that family. And if things don't work out there, if you find you need a place..." He left the sentence unfinished, but the meaning was clear. Heinrich felt tears on his face and didn't bother to wipe them away, didn't feel ashamed of them. He embraced Dutch, feeling the older man stiffen in surprise before relaxing and returning the embrace, a moment of connection that transcended all the barriers of language and culture and history that should have made it impossible. When they separated, Heinrich carefully wrapped the spurs back in their cloth and tucked them away, a tangible piece of this impossible time that he would carry with him always. The transport left on a morning that was already hot despite the early hour, the sun just clearing the horizon and promising another scorching day. The prisoners gathered their few belongings, the accumulated detritus of more than a year spent in this place, items that had seemed worthless when they arrived but which now carried profound meaning. A belt-buckle Boss had helped Klaus forge in the ranch workshop. A pocket knife Jimmy had given Friedrich for his birthday, when they had all pretended not to notice how moved Friedrich was by the gesture. Photographs taken with a borrowed camera, grainy images that captured moments of shared labor and reluctant smiles, evidence that this had been real, that it had happened, that they had not imagined this strange interlude between the horrors of war. The Cowboys came to see them off, standing in a loose group near the trucks, their faces carefully neutral in that way that men use to hide emotion they don't quite know how to express. There were handshakes, firm grips that lasted perhaps a moment longer than necessary, eyes meeting and holding, conveying things that words couldn't capture. Tex, who had rarely spoken throughout their entire time there, surprised everyone by pulling out his harmonica and playing a tune, something slow and melancholy that might have been a hymn or a cowboy ballad or something he had made up on the spot, and the sound of it carried across the prairie, achingly beautiful in its simplicity. As the trucks pulled away, kicking up dust that obscured the figures of the Cowboys, Heinrich turned for one last look at the ranch. He saw the barracks where they had slept, the corrals where they had learned to work with horses, the vast empty prairie stretching beyond, and he understood with sudden clarity that he was leaving behind something irreplaceable. This had been, against all odds and expectations, a kind of home, and these men who should have been his enemies had become something closer to brothers, bound together by shared experience and the thousand small acts of trust and cooperation that had defined their daily existence. He thought of Dutch's words about returning someday, and while he knew the chances were slim, knew that the demands of rebuilding his life in Germany would consume him for years if not decades, he made himself a promise to remember this place, to honor what had happened here by carrying forward the lessons he had learned. The journey home was long and bureaucratically complex, involving multiple camps and processing centers and the general chaos of a world trying to reassemble itself after years of destruction. Heinrich moved through it in a kind of daze, his mind still partially back on that ranch, still feeling the movement of a horse beneath him and the weight of a rope in his hands. He slept poorly, troubled by dreams that mixed memories of battle with images of cattle drives, Wehrmacht uniforms with cowboy boots, the sound of artillery with the sound of thunder rolling across the plains. He carried the spurs Dutch had given him wrapped carefully in his few possessions, and sometimes at night he would unwrap them just to hold them, to feel their solid weight and remember that it had all been real, that he hadn't invented it as some elaborate coping mechanism for captivity. Stuttgart, when he finally reached it 6 months after leaving Texas, was almost unrecognizable. Whole neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, buildings he had known his entire life simply gone, replaced by empty lots where grass and weeds were already beginning to reclaim the space. The apartment building where he had lived with his wife and daughter had survived, damaged but still standing, one of the lucky structures that had been spared the worst of the bombing. He climbed the stairs with his heart hammering, uncertain what he would find, whether they would even still be there, whether the woman who had written those letters would recognize the man he had become. The door opened before he could knock, and his wife stood there, older and thinner than he remembered, her hair shot through with gray that hadn't been there before, but her eyes were the same. They stared at each other for a moment that stretched into eternity, and then she was in his arms and he was holding her, feeling the realness of her, the solid proof that she had survived, that they had both somehow made it through the nightmare. His daughter appeared in the doorway, no longer the child he had left but a girl verging on adolescence, wary and uncertain, studying this stranger who claimed to be her father. He knelt down to her level, this man who had learned patience from teaching horses to accept a saddle, and smiled. "Hello, Greta," he said softly. "I have so many stories to tell you." Rebuilding took years, as Dutch had predicted it would. Heinrich found work first as a laborer, clearing rubble and hauling stone, his hands that had once held nothing heavier than chalk and textbooks now calloused and strong from his time on the ranch. Eventually, as schools began to reopen and society slowly stitched itself back together, he returned to teaching, standing before classrooms of children who had known only war and deprivation and trying to give them something to hope for, some vision of a world that could be different, better, more just. He taught literature and history, but he also taught them about responsibility and hard work and the ways that people from different backgrounds could learn to work together if they chose to see their common humanity rather than their differences. He wrote to Dutch, letters that took months to arrive and whose responses came even more slowly, but which maintained the connection across the vast distance between Texas and Germany. The letters were never eloquent, neither man being particularly gifted with written words, but they conveyed the essential information, the continued existence and well-being of both parties. Dutch wrote about the ranch, about cattle prices and weather and the young horses he was breaking. Heinrich wrote about reconstruction, about his daughter's progress in school, about the slow return to something approaching normalcy. They were letters between friends, simple and sincere, a thin thread connecting two worlds that had briefly intersected in the most unlikely way. Klaus did return to Texas, though it took him 5 years to manage it, 5 years of rebuilding his family's farm in Bavaria and saving enough money to afford the passage. He arrived with his wife and 2 children, nervous about whether the offer Dutch had made so long ago still stood, whether he would be welcome or whether the passage of time and the fading of wartime bonds had made the whole thing seem like a fever dream. But Dutch met him at the bus station in the nearest town, older and grayer but still recognizably himself, and the first thing he said was, "Took you long enough," with that deadpan delivery that Klaus remembered so well. Klaus worked on the ranch for 3 years before buying his own place just north of Dutch's property, raising cattle and horses and becoming a fixture in the local community, his German accent gradually softening but never quite disappearing, a reminder of origins that he never tried to hide or deny. Friedrich never made it back to Germany. He died in the winter of 1947, pneumonia complicated by malnutrition and the general toll that war and captivity had taken on his body. The news reached Heinrich through a letter from Friedrich's sister, and he mourned not just the loss of his friend but the waste of it all, the fact that Friedrich had survived years of war and captivity only to die in the supposed peace that followed. He thought of Friedrich learning to gentle horses, the infinite patience he had shown, the gentleness that had seemed at odds with his military bearing but which had been perhaps his truest self, finally allowed to emerge in the safety of that Texas ranch. At Friedrich's memorial service, Heinrich spoke about Texas, about the cowboys who had treated them with dignity, about the work they had done and the friendships they had forged, and several people in attendance looked at him strangely, as if they couldn't quite believe these stories, as if the idea of German prisoners working alongside American cowboys seemed too improbable to be real. But it had been real, and as the years passed and the sharp edges of memory softened into something more bearable, Heinrich found himself thinking about that time more and more often. He thought about it when he saw horses, wondered if they were as patient and intelligent as Pepper, Dutch's mare. He thought about it when thunderstorms rolled through, remembering the pure terror and exhilaration of riding through that storm, trying to turn the cattle. He thought about it when he taught his students about the war, trying to help them understand that history was not just about grand movements and political ideologies, but about individual people making choices about how to treat each other, about cowboys who could have been cruel to their captives but chose instead to teach them, to trust them, to treat them as fellow workers rather than defeated enemies. In 1965, 22 years after that first transport had delivered him to the ranch, Heinrich finally returned to Texas. It had taken him that long to save enough money, to arrange time away from his teaching duties, to work up the courage to see whether the place matched his memories or whether time and nostalgia had transformed it into something that had never quite existed. He brought his wife and Greta, now a young woman herself, a university student studying architecture and full of ideas about rebuilding not just buildings but entire societies. They flew to Dallas and then drove west, the landscape unfolding before them in its familiar vastness, and with each mile, Heinrich felt something in his chest loosening, some tension he hadn't quite realized he was carrying. The ranch looked smaller than he remembered, but also more substantial, the buildings weathered but well-maintained, new fences replacing old ones, the whole operation showing the signs of careful stewardship across decades. Dutch was waiting on the porch of the main house, and when he saw Heinrich get out of the rental car, he stood and walked down the steps, moving a little more stiffly than Heinrich remembered but still with that deliberate grace. They met in the yard, and for a moment, they just looked at each other, two men who had been young and were now middle-aged, who carried the weight of years and experience but who recognized something essential in each other that had not changed. "Well," Dutch said finally, that single word somehow containing everything, welcome and affection and acknowledgement of the strangeness and wonder of this reunion. "Well," Heinrich echoed, and then they were embracing, and Heinrich was introducing his family, and Dutch was calling into the house for his wife, a woman named Sarah whom he had married 5 years earlier, and suddenly the yard was full of people, Klaus arriving with his family, Jimmy driving up with his wife and children, Tex appearing on horseback because of course he did. And it was chaos and it was beautiful and it was everything Heinrich had hoped it might be. They stayed for 2 weeks, and in that time, Heinrich showed his wife and daughter the places that had meant so much to him, the barracks where he had slept, now used for storage but still standing. The corral where he had first learned to ride. The pasture where they had turned the cattle during that storm. Greta listened to these stories with an expression that cycled between disbelief and fascination, trying to reconcile the father she knew, a quiet literature teacher who rarely spoke about his war experiences, with this other person who had ridden horses and chased cattle and lived in a world so foreign to anything she had known. His wife Sarah, Heinrich's wife not Dutch's, though the coincidence of names prompted much amusement, simply held his hand and listened, understanding perhaps better than their daughter the significance of this place in her husband's history, the way it had shaped him into the man who had returned to her. On their last evening, Dutch organized a dinner, a Texas barbecue that involved more meat than Heinrich had seen in one place since the war and was attended by what seemed like half the county. There were former prisoners who had settled in the area, there were cowboys from neighboring ranches, there were townspeople who had heard the stories and wanted to meet these Germans who had once worked on Dutch's ranch. There was music, fiddles and guitars and yes, a harmonica, and there was dancing, and there was laughter, and in the midst of it all, Heinrich stood with Dutch and Klaus and Jimmy and Tex, the core group who had lived through those extraordinary months together, and they raised their glasses in a toast. To second chances, Dutch said simply. To unlikely friendships, Klaus added. To remembering, Heinrich said. And they drank, and in that moment, the past and present seemed to collapse together, all the years between then and now compressing into something unified and whole. The spurs Heinrich had carried back to Germany, Dutch's father's spurs that had become his most treasured possession, were now being carried back to Texas. Heinrich presented them to Dutch's stepson, a young man of about 20 who was learning the ranching business and who listened with wide eyes to the stories of how Heinrich had earned them. Your step-grandfather gave these to me when I needed to know that I was more than just a prisoner, Heinrich explained. That I was a person, a man, someone who had value beyond my nationality or my status. I've kept them safe all these years, but I think they belong here, where they were forged, where they mean something in the daily life of working this land. The young man took them with a solemnity that suggested he understood the weight of what he was receiving, not just physical objects but a legacy, a story about how people could choose to see each other's humanity even in the worst of circumstances, and how that choice could ripple forward through time, creating connections and possibilities that transcended the original moment. On the drive back to Dallas, Greta was quiet, processing everything she had seen and heard. Finally, she spoke from the back seat, her voice thoughtful. "Papa, why did you never tell us these stories? Why did it take so long for us to come here?" Heinrich considered the question, wanting to give her an honest answer. "Because for a long time, I wasn't sure they were real," he said slowly. "Because what happened here seemed so different from everything else in the war, so strange and unlikely, that I worried if I talked about it too much, I would somehow diminish it or make it seem less significant. And because..." He paused, searching for the right words. "Because I needed to make sure that Germany, that our life there, that you and your mother were my real home, my real life. I couldn't let myself get too caught up in nostalgia for this place, even though it meant so much to me." His wife reached over and squeezed his hand. "But we can hold both things," she said softly. "We can be grateful for what happened here, for these men who treated you with dignity and taught you so much, and still have our life in Stuttgart be our real home. They don't have to be in competition." And she was right, of course. He had spent so many years trying to keep these worlds separate, worried that acknowledging how much Texas had meant to him would somehow diminish his commitment to rebuilding Germany, to his family, to the life he had fought so hard to reclaim. But they could coexist, these different parts of his history, each informing and enriching the other, creating a whole that was more complex and interesting than either piece alone. Heinrich continued to teach for another decade, retiring in 1975 at the age of 62. In his final lecture to his students, he told them about the ranch, about cowboys who had greeted German prisoners with boots and saddles instead of batons and cruelty, about learning that enemies could become colleagues and even friends if people chose to see each other as individuals rather than as representatives of nations or ideologies. Some of the students looked skeptical, indoctrinated perhaps by decades of Cold War thinking into believing that such bridges between former enemies were impossible or naive. But others leaned forward, listening intently, recognizing perhaps that in this strange story there was something important about human nature, about the choices people make and the ripples those choices create across time. Dutch died in 1978, peacefully in his sleep, having lived to see his ranch prosper and his stepchildren grow into capable adults who would carry forward his legacy. Heinrich learned of his death through a letter from Sarah, Dutch's wife, and he sat for a long time with that letter in his hands, remembering the man who had changed his life in ways large and small. He remembered Dutch's patience in teaching him to ride, his calm in the face of crisis, his willingness to extend trust to men who theoretically should have been enemies. He remembered the spurs and what they represented, not just about horsemanship but about recognizing worth in another person, about seeing potential where others might see only a defeated captive. At the funeral, which Heinrich flew back to Texas to attend, Klaus gave the eulogy, speaking in English that still carried traces of his German accent but which was fluent and eloquent. He talked about Dutch as a teacher, a friend, a man who embodied the best of what it meant to be an American cowboy, not the mythological figure of dime novels and movies, but the real thing, a person who worked hard, kept his word, treated others fairly, and saw past superficial differences to the essential humanity beneath. He taught us about horses and cattle, Klaus said, his voice breaking slightly, but more importantly, he taught us about being men, about honor and responsibility and the kind of strength that comes from choosing kindness when you could choose cruelty. The cemetery was on a hill overlooking the ranch, a small plot where Dutch's first wife was buried along with several generations of ranchers who had worked this land. The wind carried the smell of grass and dust, and as they lowered Dutch's coffin into the earth, Heinrich thought about cycles and continuity, about how this land would outlast all of them but would carry forward the imprint of what they had done here, the relationships they had forged, the choices they had made. He thought about the young men who had stumbled off that transport truck in 1943, terrified and uncertain, and the different men who had eventually left, changed in fundamental ways by their time here. He thought about all the moments of choice, large and small, that had shaped what happened, Dutch's decision to treat them as workers rather than enemies, his own decision to embrace the opportunity rather than remain bitter and closed off, all the tiny decisions that had accumulated into something significant. Heinrich lived another 20 years, dying in 1998 at the age of 85, having seen Germany reunified and the Cold War end, having witnessed transformations in the world that he couldn't have imagined in his youth. In his final years, when Greta and his grandchildren would visit, he would tell them stories about Texas, about the cowboys and the cattle and the vast empty spaces that had once been his prison and then his classroom and finally his second home. He would show them photographs, faded and creased, of young men squinting into the sun, cowboys and prisoners standing together, the artificial divisions between them invisible in the captured image. He would hold the spurs, return to him after Dutch's stepson insisted he should have them back, and he would remember. The legacy of what happened on that ranch extended beyond the individuals who experienced it. Klaus's children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally at home in German and English, American and European contexts, living embodiments of the idea that identity could be complex and multiple rather than singular and exclusive. Some of them became ranchers themselves, carrying forward the traditions Dutch had taught their father. Others became teachers or businesspeople or artists, but all of them carried stories about their father's time as a prisoner of war and the cowboys who had treated him with respect, and those stories shaped how they viewed the world and their place in it. In Stuttgart, Heinrich's students over the years numbered in the thousands, and many of them remembered the stories he told about Texas, about learning that the world was more complex than propaganda suggested, that people could transcend the roles assigned to them by history if they chose to do so. Some of those students became diplomats or worked in international organizations, carrying forward a belief in the possibility of reconciliation and cooperation across national boundaries. Others simply remembered the lesson when dealing with their own lives and relationships, choosing to see individuals rather than stereotypes, to build bridges rather than walls. The ranch itself continued to operate, eventually passing to Klaus's son when Klaus retired, and then to his grandson, each generation maintaining the traditions while adapting to changing economic realities and technological advances. They still ran cattle, though the herd was smaller than in Dutch's day. They still broke horses, though now they also hosted agrotourism, city people paying to experience a few days of cowboy life, sleeping in modernized versions of the old barracks and learning to ride on patient horses who tolerated incompetence with admirable grace. And in the main house, now expanded and renovated but still recognizable, there hung a collection of photographs and artifacts from that period during the war when German prisoners had worked alongside cowboys, a small museum of an unlikely moment in history. Historians eventually discovered the story, academic researchers interested in prisoner of war experiences and labor arrangements during World War II. They interviewed the surviving participants, now elderly men whose memories were vivid about some things and vague about others, and they wrote papers and articles about this unusual example of cooperation between captives and captors. Some academics focused on the practical aspects, the labor arrangements and economic factors that made such cooperation beneficial. Others examined the psychological and sociological dimensions, trying to understand how bonds formed across such profound divisions. But what no amount of academic analysis could quite capture was the lived reality of those days, the texture and feel of that experience, the way it had shaped lives in ways both obvious and subtle. There is a tendency, when looking at history, to reduce it to abstractions, to grand narratives about nations and ideologies, victories and defeats. Wars become collections of dates and battles, lists of casualties and strategic decisions made by generals and politicians far from the actual fighting. But history is also made up of millions of individual moments, small human interactions that may seem insignificant in isolation but which collectively create the actual experience of living through historical events. The story of German prisoners working on a Texas ranch was one such collection of moments, and while it changed nothing about the war's outcome or the global political situation, it changed everything for the men who lived it, and through them, it rippled forward, affecting their families and communities in ways both measurable and intangible. What Dutch understood, and what he acted upon, was something deceptively simple yet profoundly difficult to implement, that even in the context of war, even when dealing with people officially designated as enemies, It was possible to maintain basic human decency, to see individuals rather than categories, to treat people with respect rather than cruelty. It wasn't naive idealism that motivated him, he was too practical for that. It was simply his conviction that being cruel didn't make the work go better, didn't produce better results, didn't serve any purpose except to diminish everyone involved. So he chose a different path, and in choosing it, he created space for something unexpected and beautiful to emerge, friendships and understanding that transcended the divisions war had created. For the prisoners, that experience became a touchstone, proof that even in the darkest times, humanity could persist, that not everyone was consumed by hatred, that it was possible to find dignity and purpose even in captivity. Many of them carried psychological wounds from the war, trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. But their time on the ranch was different, a period where they were allowed to be useful, competent, valued, where they could exercise skills and develop new ones, where they were treated as men rather than as defeated enemies to be punished. That made a difference in their ability to reintegrate into civilian life when they finally returned home, gave them confidence and resilience they might not have had otherwise. The story of cowboys greeting German POWs with boots rather than batons is ultimately a story about choice, about the agency individuals maintain even within constrained circumstances to decide how they will treat each other. Dutch and the other cowboys could have been cruel, nothing would have stopped them, and given the context of wartime and the propaganda that encouraged seeing enemies as less than human, many would have understood such cruelty. But they chose differently. The prisoners could have remained sullen and uncooperative, doing the minimum required and maintaining maximum distance from their captors, nursing their resentment and bitterness. But they too chose differently. And in those choices, multiplied across hundreds of days and thousands of interactions, something emerged that neither group could have predicted or planned, a community of sorts, temporary and strange but genuine. Years later, when scholars interviewed the few surviving participants, now in their 80s and 90s, memories fading but still holding on to the essential emotional truth of that experience, they asked what it had meant, what lessons could be drawn. The answers were varied, often halting as elderly men struggled to articulate experiences that had shaped them at a fundamental level. But certain themes emerged consistently: the importance of treating people with dignity regardless of circumstances, the possibility of finding common ground even across profound differences, the way that shared work and shared challenges could create bonds stronger than ideology or nationalism, the understanding that enemies were made by politics and could be unmade by personal connection and choice. One of the last surviving prisoners, in an interview conducted just before his death in 2003, said something that captured perhaps the essence of what that experience had meant. "We went to that ranch as defeated soldiers, broken men who had lost everything, and we left as human beings again. The cowboys taught us that our identity wasn't just about being German or being in the Wehrmacht or having lost the war. We could be workers, horsemen, men who contributed something valuable. That gift, of being allowed to be useful and skilled and respected, that was worth more than freedom itself in some ways, because it gave us back ourselves." The landscape of that Texas ranch remains largely unchanged, the same vast spaces and endless sky, the same wind carrying the smell of grass and dust, the same fundamental character that shaped everyone who spent time there. But it is also transformed, layered with the memories and meanings of those who passed through, marked by the choices they made and the relationships they forged. The land remembers, in its way, the sound of German voices mixing with Texas drawl, the sight of men from opposite sides of a war working together toward common goals, the possibility that existed, however briefly, of seeing past difference to shared humanity. And in remembering, it offers a kind of testimony, evidence that even in the worst of times, another way was possible, that cowboys could greet German POWs with boots, teaching them to ride and work and be men again, rather than with batons meant only to punish and control. That they made this choice, and that the prisoners accepted and reciprocated it, remains a small but significant triumph of human decency over the forces of hatred and division, a story worth preserving and telling, now and for the future.